In the next half hour, I'm going to introduce you to the study of the classical world and the ancient world in Birkbeck. I'll say a bit, first of all, I think like Tim did, about the structure of the course and so on, but then I'll try and move on fairly quickly to just give you a quick sample of the kind of topics that we teach and how we teach them. And then at the end, I'll make sure I leave lots of time for you to raise questions or anything that you're particularly interested in related to the ancient world or to Birkbeck. So I expect lots of you are interested in one of these 3 degrees, and all of them can be taken with the foundation year beforehand. So we have a BA in Classical Studies, which is really focused on the literature and culture and history of the ancient world, a BA in Classics, which is much more linguistically focused. So that's for those of you who really want to pursue Greek and Latin to a high level, although you will be encouraged to do lots of Greek and Latin too in the other degrees. And finally, our degree in Ancient History and Archaeology, which Tim probably also talked about, gives you a chance to combine the study of the history of the ancient world with archaeological method, archaeological finds, and so on. So there's a lot of flexibility within each of these programs, and obviously you can pick which one of them best appeals to your interests. Here's just an introduction to me and some of my colleagues. These are the core teaching staff working on the ancient world. In the middle, Prof. Jen Baird and Prof. Catherine Edwards are great experts and specialists in Roman history, especially the history and archaeology of the Roman Empire, and they'll be doing a lot of the Roman teaching. Christy Konstantakopoulou on the left, and I on the right specialize in Greek history, Greek literature, Greek thought. So we'll be taking lots of the Greek parts of the course, and I'm very interested too in the sort of crossover between Greek culture and Roman culture, how they're related to each other. So lots of my teaching brings that in. That's reflected in this picture on the slide. This is one of the flourishing Greek-speaking cities of the Roman period in Lycia, which is the southwestern bit of Turkey. A wonderful theatre in Myra, in the city of Myra. You've probably read or heard from others this afternoon about the sort of overall structure of our degrees. I'm just going to talk a bit about the specifically ancient options that you can take in the first year of the main BA. So for some of you, this would be after taking the foundation year when you enter the first year of the BA. The sort of core ancient option where all the lecturers contribute and we get to know each other, students and lecturers, is called the Ancient World, and that's a course that runs through the first year, where we try and give you a really deep introduction to this very rich history of the ancient Mediterranean, history, but also archaeology, literature, a bit of philosophy, and introduce you to all the types of evidence that we use in classics and ancient history, not only literary texts like Homer or Herodotus, but inscriptions, coins, papyrus from Egypt, everything that we can learn from archaeology, including artistic visual evidence. So that's a wonderful course where we get to know each other, and we sort of lay the foundation so that in later years you can specialize in what you're particularly interested in the ancient world. In the first year, if you're doing classics or classical studies, you'll definitely do at least one language module. So lots of people start with Introduction to Latin, Beginner's Latin or Beginner's Greek. If you've done some before, you can start at another level. We have lots of different levels to suit different experience and different interests. In the first year, you can also pick some other modules. There's one core module which all students in the department take that you've probably heard about, not only classic students but also history and archaeology students, which tries to tie together those 3 disciplines of our department and ask what historians can learn from classicists, what classicists can learn from archaeologists, and so on. So that's a real sort of unique feature of our department, that we really try to put ancient culture in a much broader context and ask what does this matter for the history of the world, the history of world culture. How should we place Greek and Roman civilization and languages and history and thought in that much broader context? What can we learn from other disciplines? What can we learn from what modern historians are doing, the kind of techniques they use, the kind of questions they ask about gender or about empire, for example? How can we bring that back into our study of the ancient world and enrich our study of the ancient world? So you'll definitely be encouraged to think in very broad terms about your studies and take sample modules in other areas, particularly in archaeology, obviously, but also maybe in other periods of history, the medieval world, runs parallel to the ancient world, and there's lots of discussion, for example, of the Byzantine Empire, so the successor empire, the Roman Empire in the east, on which we also have a specialist, Dr. Rebecca Darley. In years 2 and 3 of the full-time BA, or 2, 3, and 4 of the part-time BA, you get to, that's when you really, having built that foundation in the first year, you get to branch out and really pursue what you're most interested in. I put on this slide some examples of the modules that we're running at the moment. Obviously, this changes depending on staff interest. All of these modules are quite tailored to the research of our particular staff, so each module is informed by latest thinking and all of the lecturers' individual work and research on these topics. So I teach, for example, a module that I'm running at the moment on Greek and Roman political thought in context. You'll hear a bit more about that in a minute, but that's really enjoyable and vibrant module for me, where we get to discuss in detail Plato's Republic, so one of the great foundational works of political thought, also Cicero's Republic, which is a Roman response to Plato, and we also debate how we might look differently at modern politics and modern society if we look at them having examined ancient society and ancient politics. I'll come back to that in a moment, but do have a look through the rest of the list as well. These are other modules that reflect the research specialisms of my colleagues. The Athenian Empire and the Empire of Letters are the highest level modules. That's what you take usually in the final year. And Journeys to the Underworld and Greek and Roman Political Thought are the level 5 modules that you take in year 2 or 3 of the part-time degree. At the same time, we encourage you to do as much Latin and Greek as you can. Obviously, it's not for everyone, but those of you who can keep going with Latin and Greek, that really enriches your study of other aspects of the ancient world. And our Latin and Greek offering is very, very flexible and can be tailored to suit your particular interests. And the goal is to build up to a point where you can really read authors like Homer, Plato, Virgil, Cicero, the famous classical authors in the original, in our set book modules, Greek set book and Latin set book. I should also mention a new initiative which the Birkbeck has very close links through my colleague Christy Constantakopoulou with a very exciting excavation on an Aegean island, the island of Despotico, where not very long ago Greek archaeologists discovered a wonderful but also mysterious sanctuary that we didn't know much about before, but this was obviously a massive religious site in the early part of Greek history, an archaic period. And this is being excavated annually, and Birkbeck students for the last few years have been very involved in this, and now we're running a module at level 5, so that's the sort of intermediate level, called the Archaeology of a Greek Sanctuary, where the focus is on the excavation of this sanctuary and all the new discoveries. And certainly in a normal year you would get as part of that module to go out and participate in the excavation. Let's hope next year that will be possible again. Here, the next few slides, I won't dwell on these. This is a sort of more technical summary that you can also find online, or we can share these slides, or you can take a screenshot now. This is a more technical summary of the structure of our different programs, with the full-time version of each degree on the left and the part-time version on the right. So there's classical studies, there's classics, and there's ancient history and archaeology. So we can come back to that, or we can make this information available. I see there are already some questions in the chat about the structure of the course. I think I'll give now this sort of very brief sample, lecture sample introduction to ancient democracy, and then we can come back in the last part of the session to answer questions both about democracy and about the structure of the course. The sample topic that I'm going to talk about briefly now is this one of democracy and voting in the ancient and modern worlds, and this is related to my research and to my teaching on ancient democracy and ancient politics. So this is close to what I teach both in the ancient world module in the first year and that module on Greek and Roman political thought in the second year. And of course, voting, I mean, I suppose these two things, democracy and voting, very much go together in the way that we think about these concepts. So the sort of core image we would have of a democratic system might be people voting. But one of the interesting things about studying ancient democracy alongside modern democracy is that voting worked in very different ways in ancient democracies, especially in the city of Athens, but there are also many other democratic city-states around the Greek world. That's why I've given you this map, which shows not only Athens, more or less in the middle of the map, but also all these other marked places. Lots of these places at some time in their history in the ancient world had a democratic constitution where voting by all citizens was absolutely crucial. But this was a different type of voting from what we're used to. So if we picture the sort of classical modern democratic scene, that would be the voters going to the polls and casting their vote for a representative to sit in parliament and represent the constituency. That was quite alien, really, to ancient ways of thinking about democracy, and something which in a way is shocking when you first encounter it, is that to an ancient way of thinking, certainly to an ancient Athenian way of thinking, that type of voting for individuals to hold political power is actually suspect from a democratic point of view. To an ancient Athenian, that wouldn't have sounded democratic at all. Does anyone have any ideas you can put in the chat of why that kind of voting for individuals might have been considered slightly less than democratic? Maybe it's still slightly less than democratic for us. Bribery is a good suggestion. So this comes down to wealth, and this is absolutely crucial to understanding the way that ancient democracy worked. That the ancient democracy was all about trying to ensure that no one gained a special advantage if they were wealthy. And as Sophie mentioned in the chat, if you have elections as we do, then the wealthy can use their resources. They can use it in outright bribery, but they can also use their wealth for more subtle forms of attracting support. They can give hospitality, invite people around to their house, invite people to big parties. Rachel says this, so voting for representatives is not a direct form of democracy. That's a very important distinction, that modern democracy is so-called representative democracy, where you vote for a representative. But ancient democracy was a direct form of democracy, which means that people voted in the assembly of a Greek city such as Athens directly for on decisions, also on laws. So this is a big difference. Does anyone know how the Athenians did appoint people? That obviously they couldn't have every decision being made by the whole citizen body. Does anyone know how the Athenians got around this problem of this problem of the rich potentially using their wealth to gain disproportionate power? Have any of you maybe seen this machine before? This is one of the great technological advances from classical Athens, the sort of meeting of technology and politics. So this is a machine that was designed to pick names at random. So you put into the slots tokens with the name of a particular citizen, and then it came up with a random assortment with equal representation for different parts of the citizen body. And this was the way, in fact, that the Athenians selected people to sit on juries, which is a bit like what we also do, perhaps. But this was also the way that the Athenians chose people to hold very important offices, to manage the marketplace, to manage the city finances. So this is a reminder of how different a system this was, and you have to think of this a bit like as if when you open your letter, as we do, to be summoned for jury service, maybe that letter could one day say you're going to be Prime Minister, you're going to be in the cabinet, Secretary of State for Trade, Secretary of State for Education for a year, and Athenian offices always change year to year, again, to avoid any individual or any individual faction becoming dominant over others. So some people even now suggest this would be a good way to sort of rejuvenate our democracy if we replace the House of Lords, for example, with a chamber where people were selected to serve for a month or a year by lottery, but obviously we would use a computer rather than this wonderful machine, the Clariterion from Athens. But the principle would be the same, that you would pick randomly perhaps a certain number of people from each geographical division of the country or the region concerned, which is more or less what the Athenians did with the help of this machine. There are lots of interesting questions coming up in the chat, which I'll come back to in a moment. I'll just show you a couple more slides. On the other hand, I said the Athenians didn't believe in voting for individuals, but in fact, one of the ways that they did vote for individuals was in the institution of ostracism. which is very alien to us, and to most cultures. This was another very distinctive Athenian invention, that every year in the 5th century BC, so the high point of the Athenian democracy, there was a vote about whether the city wanted to carry out a vote on an ostracism. And if there was a vote in favor, then 2 months later there would be an actual vote, and citizens would be invited to submit a piece of pot. This is an ostrakon, this is where the word ostracism comes from, with the name written on it of the person they wanted to see ostracized. So this is the person they wanted to see exiled from the city. And on here, those of you who've learned already a few Greek letters, you might be able to make out on the left the name of Themistocles, the famous Themistocles, and on the right, an even more famous Athenian politician, Pericles, is the top word, and then the name of his father underneath. So here, I mean, these kind of pieces of evidence are an example of how, when you look beyond the basic literary text like Herodotus or Thucydides, you start getting a really direct insight into the sort of real life running of ancient society. And so this is a real insight into a society that's so different from ours, but we get a sense here of how this institution of ostracism is connected with lots of broader questions in ancient history, for example, about literacy, who could write, who could read. Is obviously important to how democratic this system really was. Did some people have an advantage if they were more educated? I mentioned before direct democracy, or Rachel raised this in the chat, that the Athenian system is an example of direct democracy. So in a way, in our terms, we should think of this as sort of every week or every month there was a sort of referendum where everyone came and sat on this wonderful hill facing the Acropolis. The Pnyx hill is where the assembly meets. And whatever business was to be discussed, everyone who attended could make a speech and vote on it. So obviously we've had different experience with the referendums in the last few years. And the Athenian system is this astonishing one where, in a way, like I say, there's constant referring of decisions to the whole people. This is an extraordinary form of direct democracy. So in the Athenian system, if we think of this in terms of voting, it's voting for proposals in the assembly, which is important, rather than going to the polls like we do and voting for individuals. And in different courses in Birkbeck, obviously we'll probe this in much more detail and think about how this can help us to understand democracy in general, how it can help us to understand modern democracies, maybe improve modern democracies, or better understand how they work. Just to finish before we open out to questions and discussion, here's an example I mentioned before that lots of ancient Greek city-states were democratic, not just Athens. Here's an example from the city of Kos, another beautiful site, well worth visiting when it's possible, one of the great centers of ancient medical life and ancient medical research and learning, which also had a democratic constitution for many centuries. But here's an example of an inscription where the citizens of Kos put up a decision that they'd made to honor one of their citizens for his contributions. And at the end, as was sometimes the case in Greek cities, the koans recorded the result of the vote. And again, this is something which maybe would be surprising to us. There's been a vote, but there are 885 citizens voting in favor of this decision, and no citizens at all, we think, voting against it. So to our way of thinking, this sounds like a sort of suspicious election in a not particularly vibrant democracy, where all the votes go in one way. But maybe this is another prompt for us to think about the differences between ancient and modern democracy, to question whether our system is really as democratic as we instinctively think it is. Is a perfect democracy one where you get a narrow result in a vote, 52-48, 51-49, or is a true democratic system one where the citizens are so united through their communal life, through their common participation and discussion, that they can celebrate this kind of what the Greeks would have called homonoia. So one-mindedness is a massive ideal in Greek culture and certainly democratic culture. So that's just another example from outside Athens to finish, to help us again to think about this question of what are the differences, what are the similarities, what do we mean by democracy? Has there ever been a true democracy? Did the Greeks get closer than others? What were the shortcomings of Greek democracy? I'll pause there. Do put other questions either about this or about the course in general in the chat, or you can also put your microphone on if you like. I'll pick up on the questions that Sophie and David have already put while others think about their questions. Sophie asked a question a while ago about the appointments of magistrates. Sanctions in the perhaps do you mean sanctions in the sense of punishment, maybe? I mean, in that case, ostracism is a crucial example of the way that the Athenian system was designed to prevent any individual getting too powerful or overconfident. So there are all kinds of sanctions, legal sanctions, and one of the worst fates that you could suffer was to end up being voted as the candidate for an ostracism, where you had to leave Athens for a defined period of time, but nonetheless, this meant that you had to withdraw from political life. David also raised a fascinating and important question about the connection between Greek and Roman government. This is another thing that we'll really discuss in depth in the different courses in Birkbeck that I mentioned. Certainly, I think most people would agree that Greek government, certainly the Athenian one, were more democratic than the Roman Republic. On the other hand, there's lots of debate that you'll cover in Birkbeck too about whether there were in fact some democratic elements at Rome too. The assemblies at Rome were actually quite powerful. In Rome, they did elect individuals to office. So this is a bit different from Athens and the other Greek democracies, where I said that electing people to office was a bit suspect because this gave an advantage to the wealthy. Whereas in Rome, we do have all the stories about, for example, powerful politicians gathering support, holding big games, and offering hospitality in order to keep their clients happy, so people who would reliably vote for them in the assembly. So the Roman system is very different, and certainly does create more opportunities for rich individuals to sort of consolidate their power and dominate civic life. On the other hand, there were democratic elements. So the assemblies at Rome, as I say, were quite powerful. There was a lot of public rhetoric, public discussion of important issues in Rome. So that's something that Rome shared with Athens. There's a really vibrant public sphere where all issues of concern to the community are really turned over, and everyone's encouraged to take an interest, to think deeply about these questions. So yeah, that's a really interesting question that David raised, and something that we'll be studying. And in the course of the degree, this is the kind of thing that you'll come up with your own interpretation of as you read the ancient evidence, read the modern scholars' discussions of all these questions. David asked, do you think that the democracy of the Athenians was the reason for their downfall in the world of tyrants? Are you thinking about Alexander the Great there, David? Or you think, there are different periods in which the Athenian democracy was threatened. The Athenian democracy was overturned by some internal tyrants at the end of the Peloponnesian War, at the end of the 5th century. Maybe that's also what David had in mind. But in fact, that was a very brief interlude. It was less than 1 year that Athens, was under the control of the so-called 30 tyrants who were backed by the Spartans. But quite quickly, the Athenian democracy was restored. So the Athenian system is a very resilient one. So I think in a way, you can be confident because the Athenian democracy actually survived this massive defeat to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, another thing that we'll study in depth. And although democracy was briefly overturned, very quickly the Athenians decided they preferred to run things democratically rather than with a very small elite in control. And similarly, after Alexander the Great conquered so much of the known world, Athens was obviously a bit on the back foot, at least in terms of its military and political power. But Athens sustained a democratic system, modified but still democratic, for several centuries after that. So this is a really resilient system. It's a really demanding system because, like I was saying, people can be picked at random to end up sitting on the council or holding an important magistracy, an important office, for example, looking after the finances of the city. So it's a sort of demanding system for all the citizens, but clearly lots of citizens thought this was a desirable way to live, a desirable way to run their society. Have others of you got questions about this, or particularly about the course as a whole? What do you think? Can you put in the chat just type in which degree you're thinking of doing? Great, okay, so we've got a good range. Obviously, those of you who are doing history or archaeology, we encourage you too to branch out into classics and ancient history. This is one of the exciting things about the Birkbeck department, that it's very flexible and that we all work together, the lecturers in the different disciplines, history, classics and archaeology, so that we, like I was saying before, each discipline can inform the others. Lots of people for ancient history and archaeology. That's a great degree, which was introduced not very many years ago, but we've got a really big and very dynamic cohort already of students doing that. And so obviously that's a great degree because it cuts across those divisions of disciplines in the department. Another history student. Some of you applied for classics. I know David as well applied for classical studies. As I said, we can make you can find on the prospectus and on the department website lots of the basic details that I ran through quickly at the start about the structure of the degrees. But do just email me anytime if you've got questions about the specific ancient questions. I see my colleague Anne Hanley has arrived. I'll pass on to her in a minute. I'll finish with a story about these ostraca, which I'm showing on the screen. There's a famous story about an Athenian politician called Aristides, who was called by everyone the Just, Aristides the Just, and one day he was a candidate for being ostracized, and supposedly an Athenian citizen who couldn't write approached Aristides and said, will you please write the name of Aristides, not recognizing him as Aristides, will you please write the name of Aristides on this piece of pot so I can vote for him to be ostracized? And Aristides said, why? And he said, because I can't stand him always being called the Just. And Aristides said, okay, I'll write it down. And this was recounted as an example of how just Aristides was. But that's a story to a humorous story, but also a serious one to close as you think about democracy. What does that story show about democracy and literacy, how they connect democracy and personal virtue, personal morality? These are all the kind of questions that I'm looking forward to discussing further with lots of you next year. Sorry, just before Anne takes over, there are a couple more questions. You can tailor the course, this question of whether Greek or Latin is dominant, you can tailor the course to suit your particular interests. So in the first year you would do roughly even Greek and Latin or Greek and Roman things, but after that you can branch out, and if you want you can focus on Roman things, or if you want on Greek things. It's good to keep a balance, but you know, depending on your interest you can tailor the course to suit them. Marcella asked, which language would you say would be more helpful for ancient history and archaeology, Greek or Latin? It depends again on your particular interest. I mean, these are both wonderful skills to have if you want to study ancient history and archaeology at high level and really get to grips with the evidence itself. Latin is probably slightly easier to start with. It's probably worth trying out how you get on with Latin. If you do well in Latin, you can move on to Greek, which obviously has a different alphabet, so it's more challenging in some respects. But do get in touch with me, Marcel, or anyone else if you want to talk about language choices and which one might suit you better. Finally, on trips, Aisha asked about trips. Certainly most of the trips in the department and the Classic Society also, when things get back to normal, will be organising trips, are open to all students, and certainly the module on the archaeology of the Greek sanctuary, as long as you do some other archaeology modules first, I think you can sign up for that even if you're studying history, certainly history and archaeology, then you could sign up for that module, and that will give you a chance to participate in the excavation in Despotico. So everything's very flexible. I mean, we can usually tailor the course to suit what you're most interested in.